Hey, hi, hello. You know what to do. Can you go to the vocab section of your notebook and then you're going to add 6 rows now. Remember, you can hit that tab button. All right, hey, let's get into it. And let's get into it with this image here because our first term actually really hinges on this word speculative. So we're going to look at speculative fiction. You know we're in a sci-fi unit right now, but speculative fiction encompasses a lot of things, including those imagined narratives that you just wrote. Speculative, like to spectate, to think about what could be. So that's science fiction for sure. It's also fantasy. We're going to talk about the distinction between that. But it could also be things like historical fiction or even horror, ghosts, things like that. Take a moment and write out our term and our definition for speculative fiction now. All right, welcome back. Let's talk about sci-fi and fantasy, and let's actually talk about them at the same time. So here's a quick, completely oversimplified Venn diagram of these two realms. And we had this conversation in class a little bit. What is sci-fi? It's like an impossible question, right? Not too long ago, this was sci-fi, right? FaceTime was sci-fi. Sci-fi, the pace of sci-fi moves really quickly because the pace of advancements move really quickly. Fantasy has a little bit more of a root in the supernatural. Maybe there's more realms of the impossible. Oftentimes, it might even bridge into historical or like a speculative history. Think about like where Game of Thrones, that universe is set. But we do see a lot of dystopias, both in sci-fi and in fantasy, common themes of good versus evil or motifs of good versus evil, and some sort of like fantastical creatures, right? Oftentimes in fantasy, maybe that we're talking about dragons or we're talking about like unicorns or what are those winged horses called? In sci-fi, maybe we're looking at like robots. Sci-fi is going to imagine advanced technology, maybe even aliens, future life. There's some sort of explanation for it. You've probably seen this poster in my room, and if you haven't, like take a second to really get nerdy with it if you want to talk about all of these different genres of sci-fi and how they evolve over time, but I'm also going to get nerdy with you about that next week's vocab. Can you take a moment to write down our term and definition for sci-fi and fantasy now? All right, welcome back. Let's really briefly just talk about origin here. So origin is where someone or something began, right? So again, when we're talking about history of science fiction in that big poster, we're talking about what were those origins. We talked in class about how what we think of currently as science fiction can be traced back for an infinite amount of time. We've always been speculating, but our kind of current genre was more or less pioneered by a 19-year-old girl named Mary Shelley, right? You wrote character origins here as well. We look at like, here's a visual for Batman's character origin here. Take a second if you want to get real nerdy, maybe take a screenshot of that. But can you write down our definition for origin now? All right, two left, utopia and dystopia. And I want you to keep in mind our friends in Omelas as we do that. So utopia, everything's perfect in one way or another. Let's look at our technical definition. Imagine a place where a state of everything is perfect, right? Here's a quick one. You might even be able to argue that this might fit under the category of like solar punk, but we'll talk about that next week. Dystopia, whew, there's a lot of examples of dystopia, right? We're talking about kind of the opposite, an imagined state or society in which there's great suffering or injustice, typically one that is totalitarian or post-apocalyptic, right? Think about Walking Dead, that's a dystopia. Hunger Games, Ender's Game. I mean, we could go on and on and on. And here's kind of an interesting little timeline here of dystopias that really heavily feature the government being really totalitarian or fascist or oppressive. And then here's another for you nerds out there, quick little characteristics of a dystopian society. Propaganda, important. If you want to write a dystopia, build in some propaganda. Information, independent thought, and freedom are restricted. Maybe there's some sort of figurehead or concept worshipped. You've got all sorts of things. Citizens live in a dehumanized state. You could also take this into the zombie survival, whatever you want to do. Think also about Omelas, which appeared to be a utopia, but perhaps in fact was a dystopia. Can you take a moment now and write down our term and definition for utopia and dystopia? All right, as always, remember you don't need to record the green terms, mythology and archetype. Those are just review. Keep them in the back of your brain. And I will see you, I guess, in class as you're doing this. That's weird. Bye.